The day the Empire learned to fear kindness began with a cup of water. The loudspeakers woke the square before the sun did, pouring out their metallic announcements in 6 languages while pale blue light crept across the towers like frost climbing a window. Ethan Walker stood in the relief line with a ration crate balanced against one hip, the cold handle biting through his glove, and watched the city pretend it was still alive. Above him, occupation banners rippled between silver spires. Below them, market stalls opened in careful silence, their owners moving with the stiff caution of people who had learned that even ordinary sounds could attract the wrong attention. The air smelled like ozone, wet stone, and overheated circuitry from the filtration pumps that never quite kept up anymore. Every few seconds a cargo skiff drifted overhead, its gravity field humming low enough to rattle the loose glass in the shuttered storefronts. Ethan had been on conquered worlds before. They all developed the same look after a while. Cleaner than war, quieter than chaos, and somehow sadder than either. Order without warmth. Streets without laughter. Eyes that never stayed lifted for long. He shifted the crate and glanced at the portable readout strapped to his wrist. Water pressure in the Eastern Bloc was dropping again. If the old membranes failed before noon, half the district would be dry by supper. He was already planning which valves he could patch with recycled seals when movement near the checkpoint pulled his attention. A small alien child, no more than 4 feet tall, stood at the edge of the inspection lane with a dented metal cup held in both hands. Her skin was a soft turquoise, dull with dust, and one side of her wool wrap had come loose in the morning wind. She said something Ethan couldn't hear over the speakers, then looked up at the armored sentries with the careful hope of someone too young to know that hope should be hidden. One of the soldiers pointed toward the public fountain at the center of the square, the one that had been shut off for 3 days to conserve supply for the upper terraces. The child hesitated, then lowered her gaze and took a step back. No one around her moved. No one spoke. That was the part Ethan never got used to, not the uniforms or the ships or the cold efficiency of conquest, but the silence ordinary people built around suffering in order to survive it. He set the crate down, reached into the side pouch of his field pack, and pulled out his own canteen. It was half full, maybe less. Enough to get him through the morning if he took small sips. Not enough to waste, according to every rule that kept men alive on broken worlds. Ethan ignored every one of those rules and crossed the square. The child flinched when his boots stopped beside her, then stared as he knelt so they were nearly eye level. Up close he could see the faint silver flecks in her irises and the hairline cracks in the rim of her cup. "Hey," he said softly, unscrewing the lid. "Looks like you could use this more than I do." He poured slowly. Clear water struck the bottom of the cup with a sound so small it should have disappeared into the city, but somehow it didn't. It rang there between the loudspeakers and the skiff engines and the watchful quiet of a conquered morning. Heads turned. Conversation stopped before they began. Somewhere above the square, on a high glass balcony framed by imperial guards, Lyra Voss paused in mid-stride and looked down. Ethan felt it without seeing her, that subtle shift in the air when power notices something it does not understand. The child wrapped both hands around the cup as if it were made of light. Ethan gave her the smallest smile he had left and rose to his feet while the Empire watched a human commit the strangest act of defiance it had ever seen. He treated kindness like it still mattered. By noon, the square had swallowed the moment whole, at least on the surface. The loudspeakers kept speaking, the cargo skiffs kept drifting overhead, and the occupation banners still snapped between the towers as if fabric and metal could hold a city together by themselves. But Ethan felt the difference in the way people moved around him. Eyes followed him now, then slipped away when he looked back. A shopkeeper with 4 narrow arms pushed a small packet of filter cloth toward him without asking for credits. An old man from one of the river colonies touched 2 fingers to his chest in a gesture Ethan did not know, then hurried off. Before the nearest patrol turned the corner. It was not gratitude exactly. It was recognition. The kind that could get people in trouble. Ethan carried the crate through the lower transit corridor toward Pump Station 9, boots echoing on the steel grate walkway while warm condensation dripped from overhead pipes and spotted his jacket dark. The station sat beneath the eastern block like a tired mechanical heart, humming and shivering behind 3 security doors that no longer sealed right. When he keyed in the manual override, a gust of damp heat rolled out to meet him, carrying the mineral smell of treated water and the bitter tang of overworked motors. The pressure readout over the central tank blinked amber. Lower than before. He muttered under his breath and set the crate beside the maintenance bench. Half the replacement seals were the wrong size. Again. Typical. He had just pulled off one glove and reached into the intake housing when footsteps sounded behind him, too measured to belong to a technician and too soft to belong to a soldier in full gear. Ethan straightened slowly and turned. Lyra Voss stood in the doorway with 2 imperial guards behind her, their helmets reflecting the pale instrument lights. Up close, she looked even less like the rest of the city than she had from below the balcony. Her uniform was slate gray with narrow silver lines at the collar and cuffs, severe enough to seem carved rather than sewn. Her skin held that cool blue-green cast he had noticed in the square, like sea glass seen through winter light, and her eyes were the color of polished metal. She did not carry a weapon in sight. She did not need one. "Mr. Walker," she said, and his name in her voice sounded less like a greeting than a document being opened. "You have made yourself unusually visible today." Ethan wiped his hand on a shop towel and looked back at the failing gauge before answering. "Funny thing about thirsty kids. They do that." One of the guards shifted, clearly not pleased. Lyra only studied him. There was no anger on her face. That would have been easier. Curiosity was harder to manage. "Do you often ignore protocol?" she asked. Ethan crouched again and loosened the cracked ring around the membrane housing. "Only the ones that leave people dry, cold, or scared for no good reason." The station groaned beneath them, followed by a hollow clang somewhere deep in the filtration stack. Ethan glanced at the ceiling, judged the vibration, and felt the small knot of concern tighten between his shoulders. If Line 4 gave out, the eastern residences would lose pressure before sunset. Lyra seemed to notice the shift in him. "You are aware," she said, "that your actions in the square have already generated reports." "I figured kindness was still legal." "In an occupied district," she replied, stepping one pace closer, "nothing is merely kindness." For a second the room held only the hiss of steam and the slow pulse of the backup pumps. Ethan looked at her then, really looked, and saw something he had not expected beneath the composure and polished authority. Not softness. Not guilt. Just the faintest trace of distance, as if some part of her was standing outside her own empire and watching it speak. He tightened the new seal into place and rose to face her. "Then maybe that is the real problem," he said quietly. "Maybe your system is so fragile it thinks a cup of water is a threat." One of the guards took a sharp breath, but Lyra lifted a hand and the room went still again. Her gaze did not leave his face. "You speak as if power and mercy cannot exist together." Ethan glanced at the amber pressure line climbing a fraction, then back at her. "I speak like a man who has repaired enough broken cities to know which one actually keeps people alive." Something unreadable moved across her expression, gone almost before it appeared. When she turned to leave, the station lights caught along the edge of her jaw and the silver trim of her uniform. At the threshold she paused. "There will be an inspection of the upper atmosphere processors at 1600 hours, she said without looking back. "This district cannot afford a systems failure." Ethan frowned. "That is your way of warning me?" "It is," Lyra said, "my way of seeing whether you are as foolish as you appear." Then she was gone, her guards following in perfect silence, leaving Ethan alone with the hum of the pumps, the sting of metal in the air, and the uneasy feeling that somewhere above the city, something colder than fear had just started to change. At 1600 hours the city changed color. The pale winter light that had washed the towers all day turned thinner and sharper, sliding off the glass facades in cold silver sheets while the lower streets fell into blue shadow. Ethan crossed the maintenance bridge toward the upper atmosphere processors with a tool case in one hand and a portable diagnostic slate in the other, the metal grating ringing under his boots with each step. Far below, the market square looked smaller than it had that morning, reduced to moving dots and strips of faded fabric, but he could still pick out the dry fountain at its center like a scar that had not healed. Up here the air tasted cleaner, filtered and thinned by altitude, but it carried a different smell too, one Ethan had learned to distrust on old stations and failing colonies alike: insulation running too hot. He stopped beside the outer service panel of processor ring 3 and rested his palm against the housing. Warm. Too warm. A few feet away, a line of imperial personnel stood waiting in crisp formation, their polished uniforms untouched by grease, rain, or real work. Lyra Voss stood at the front of them, hands folded behind her back, her posture so composed it made the wind seem rude by comparison. The silver trim at her collar caught the last of the daylight, and her blue-green skin almost seemed to hold it. "You came," she said as Ethan reached the platform. "You sounded disappointed when you said it," he replied, setting down the tool case. Lyra ignored that. "This processor supplies atmospheric stabilization for the government quarter, 2 medical spires, and the transit shield over the eastern district. We detected an irregularity at 1432. Our engineers have not isolated the cause." Ethan glanced past her at the sealed access hatch. "Then your engineers are looking in the wrong place." One of the officials stiffened at that, but Lyra only stepped aside and let him pass. The gesture was small, almost invisible, yet everyone on the platform noticed it. Ethan did too. People who were used to command did not move for men in work jackets unless something inside them had already begun to shift. He opened the hatch and climbed into the service channel, where heat wrapped around him at once, heavy and dry, with the bitter smell of scorched dust caught in the vents. The processor core hummed through the walls, not steady but uneven, a rhythm with a stumble in it. He crouched beside the conduit rack and clipped his diagnostic leads into the local array. Numbers flickered across the slate. Pressure fluctuations. Microfractures in the intake seals. A calibration drift that should have been corrected weeks ago. He exhaled slowly. None of this had happened by accident. It was what every conquered city became after enough time, not destroyed, just deferred. Maintained at the level of obedience, never care. "Well?" Lyra asked from the hatchway. Ethan slid out and handed her the slate. "Your intake ring is misaligned by 0.08. That does not sound like much until the pressure load jumps at nightfall. Then the whole thing starts compensating in the wrong direction." Lyra read the data without blinking. "Can it be fixed?" "Yes," Ethan said. "If somebody is willing to stop pretending that emergency maintenance is the same thing as stewardship." A faint breeze moved across the platform, carrying the distant chime of transit beacons and the soft rumble of skiffs docking along the western towers. Below them the city kept breathing in its careful, tired way. Lyra lowered the slate. "You speak as if you know this place intimately." Ethan knelt and opened his case, arranging his tools in the order he liked them: torque key, sealant injector, fiber line, thermal patch kit. Familiar things. Honest things. "I know broken systems," he said. "And I know what it means when nobody fixes them until the important people get nervous." He worked while she watched, loosening a warped bracket and reseating the alignment collar by hand because the servo rig on site had not been serviced in months. The metal was hot enough to sting through his glove. Sweat gathered at the back of his neck despite the cold outside. After a minute Lyra surprised him by stepping closer. "You have had offers to leave this district," she said. It was not a question. Ethan kept his eyes on the collar pins. "A few. And yet you remained." He set the torque key, heard the satisfying click of the ring settling into place, then straightened and looked at her. Somebody had to. For the first time since he had met her, Lyra Voss seemed to forget the Empire for a second. It showed only in her eyes. In the brief quiet that entered them like a door opening onto somewhere unguarded. Most people choose survival, she said. Ethan wiped his hand on a clean cloth and reached for the sealant line. Maybe this is mine. The processor hum began to smooth out under his fingers, the stagger in its rhythm easing into something stronger, steadier, more certain. Around them, the officials stood silent. Beneath them, a city built on force kept running because one man had decided maintenance was another form of mercy, and one woman born inside power was beginning, despite herself, to understand the difference. By the time Ethan finished resealing the last thermal seam, night had settled over the city like a sheet of dark glass. The towers no longer reflected daylight, they manufactured their own, lines of white and blue running up the sides of the government spires while transit lanes pulsed in slow ribbons across the sky. From the upper platform, the conquered district looked almost beautiful, and Ethan hated how often Empire tried to borrow beauty from electricity. He packed his tools by touch, fingers stiff from heat and metal dust, and listened to the processor behind him settle into a clean, even hum. It was the kind of sound that let hospitals keep breathing and old apartments keep their heat after midnight. Useful sound. Honest sound. The officials dispersed one by one once the status lights turned green, their polished shoes whispering across the deck. Only Lyra remained. She stood near the railing with the city spread below her, one hand resting lightly against the cold metal, her profile lit by the passing glow of a skiff overhead. For a few seconds neither of them spoke. The wind at that height was thin and sharp, carrying the faint scent of ionized air and distant rain from the weather arrays beyond the western ridge. Ethan closed the latches on his tool case and slung it down beside his leg. "Well," he said, "your district gets to keep breathing for another night." Lyra did not turn immediately. "You say that as if breathing is a political concession." Ethan walked to the railing and looked down at the lower blocks. Here and there, windows were lighting up in patterns he recognized. Families checking heaters. Shopkeepers testing cook plates. Nurses in triage wards restarting sterilizers. Small lives waiting on large systems. In a city like this, he said, it usually is. Lyra faced him then, and the composure in her expression had returned, smooth and precise as cut stone. But there was strain underneath it now, not enough for anyone else to see, enough for Ethan. 3 formal reports were filed about you after the square this morning, she said. One from the checkpoint unit, one from district administration, and one from a civilian observer seeking favor. Ethan gave a tired half-smile. You people really know how to make generosity sound dangerous. It is dangerous, she said, and this time there was nothing cold in the words. Only certainty. Not because of what it gives, but because of what it reminds others they still deserve. The platform lights clicked softer as the processor shifted to night mode. Somewhere below them a clock bell rang the hour, deep and resonant, 6 clean notes rolling through the vertical streets. Ethan rested his elbows on the railing. Then why warn me? Lyra held his gaze. Because the next report will not stop at district administration. He understood her then with uncomfortable clarity. This was not a threat. It was the nearest thing she could offer to protection without betraying the language of her station. Ethan looked back over the city. On the far side of the square, near the dry fountain, he saw movement around one of the public taps connected to the eastern relief lines. A small cluster of residents had formed there, passing containers hand to hand beneath the station lights. Calmly. Quietly. Cooperating without orders. Someone must have rerouted pressure from the repaired block. Maybe him, indirectly. Maybe someone else had noticed and chosen to continue the work. Either way, the sight settled into his chest with a strange warmth. You think if I keep my head down, this place stays safe, he said. I think, Lyra replied, that empires are less offended by sabotage than by moral embarrassment. Ethan let out a soft breath that almost became a laugh. That might be the most honest thing anyone in your uniform has said to me. For an instant, the corner of her mouth shifted. Not quite a smile. Something more cautious, as if the expression itself were unfamiliar territory. Mr. Walker, she said, "you confuse people. Only the ones who are used to being obeyed." "No," Lyra said. "The ones who are used to being afraid." The words hung between them, quiet as snowfall. Ethan straightened and reached for his tool case. As he did, he noticed something resting beside it on the deck, a folded scrap of packaging paper, weighted down by a small metal washer from his own repair kit. He picked it up and unfolded it. Inside, drawn in uneven pencil lines, was a childlike picture of a cup with 3 shining lines above it, as if water were a kind of sunrise. No signature. No message. He did not need one. When he looked up, Lyra was watching the sketch in his hand with an expression he could not fully read, something caught between puzzlement and grief. "This," Ethan said softly, sliding the drawing into the inner pocket of his jacket, "is why your reports are already too late." And for the first time since she had stepped into his life, Lyra Voss had no answer ready at all. The drawing stayed in Ethan's jacket all night, a small square of paper warming slowly against his chest as he made his rounds through the lower district. He checked boiler relays in a clinic that smelled like antiseptic and damp plaster, reset a food storage cooler behind a narrow family market, and replaced a cracked pressure valve in an apartment block where the hall lights flickered every time the lift tried to move. By the time he climbed the stairs to his own room above the maintenance depot, the city had settled into that uneasy quiet it always wore after curfew, when even the heating ducts seemed to breathe more carefully. His room was little more than a cot, a steel sink, and a fold-out desk bolted to the wall, but the old space heater worked, and tonight that counted as luxury. He set the sketch beneath the weak yellow lamp and looked at it while steam curled up from a tin cup of reheated broth. The lines were clumsy, the cup slightly crooked, the water drawn like light instead of liquid. It should not have mattered. It mattered anyway. Somewhere in this occupied city, a child had gone home and decided that what deserved to be remembered was not a uniform, a weapon, or a command, but a simple human hand pouring water. Ethan rubbed a hand over his face and let the quiet sit with him. Then the wall terminal chimed. Once. Formal channel. He crossed the room and touched the screen awake. Instead of text, a seal appeared first, imperial silver over dark blue, followed by a single line of access clearance far above anything district administration should have carried. Ethan felt the back of his neck tighten before the message even opened. It was brief. Report to Civic Archive Tower at 0800 hours. Personnel review. Attendance mandatory. No reason given. Of course not. He stood there for a moment, the terminal glow washing his room in pale light, and thought of Lyra on the upper platform saying the next report would not stop at administration. She had not exaggerated. Across the city, in a chamber lined with glass and cold records, Lyra Voss stood before a suspended projection of Ethan Walker's service history and read what her own system had never considered important. Civil engineering certification. Planetary relief assignment logs. Emergency infrastructure commendations from 3 frontier settlements. 2 transfer approvals to safer sectors, both declined. 1 transport voucher to Earth, never used. The file contained no scandals, no hidden loyalties, no evidence of organized resistance. Only a pattern. He went where systems were failing. He stayed where other people left. Even now, his supply requests were smaller than protocol allowed, his meal credits half what someone in his role could have claimed. Beside the service ledger hovered a quieter document, civilian observations compiled overnight. Shared canteen with unidentified minor. Repaired eastern pressure line after hours. Assisted clinic staff without compensation. Observed carrying heating filters into Block 12. The list was absurdly mundane, which was exactly what made it dangerous. Lyra dismissed the projection and looked out through the tower glass at the waking city. Dawn was beginning again, thin and blue, touching the roofs one by one. Down in the square, before the loudspeakers even started, she saw 2 residents at the public tap filling containers and handing them to people behind them in an orderly line. No shouting. No scrambling. Just patience. Cooperation. Behavior too small for Empire to fear and too powerful for it to ignore. At 07:45, Ethan stepped out into the morning with the child's drawing folded in his jacket and frost silvering the railings outside the depot. He had not slept much, but the air was sharp enough to clear the fog from his head. Across the avenue, an elderly vendor raised 2 fingers to his brow in a quiet greeting. A nurse from the clinic nodded as she passed. The city was changing in ways that did not make noise. That, Ethan suspected, was why the Empire had finally decided to notice him. The Civic Archive Tower rose out of the government quarter like a blade of frozen light, all clean angles and mirror glass, the kind of building designed to make ordinary people feel temporary. Ethan crossed the security plaza at 7:58 with his work jacket zipped to the throat and his tool calluses still rough against the polished visitor rail. The air up there smelled different from the lower district, less like rain and machinery, more like chilled stone and filtered perfume pushed through vents hidden in the marble seams. Even the silence felt expensive. A line of officials moved through the front atrium in muted gray, each one carrying thin data tablets and the practiced expression of someone whose job had never involved kneeling on a wet floor to fix a failed valve. Ethan gave his name at the intake desk. The attendant did not look surprised to see him. That, more than the summons itself, made him wary. He was escorted through a corridor of suspended light panels into a review chamber shaped like a half-circle, with a long transparent wall looking east over the city. From here the conquered districts seemed orderly, almost peaceful, their narrow blocks softened by distance and morning haze. Ethan knew better. Order from far away was one of Empire's favorite illusions. 3 officials sat at the curved table, their uniforms marked with administrative silver rather than military rank. Lyra Voss stood apart near the window, hands folded behind her back, her expression unreadable as the skyline beyond her. She did not acknowledge him when he entered, but he noticed the faint tightening in her jaw all the same. One of the seated officials gestured toward the lone chair opposite them. "Mr. Walker," he said, voice smooth as polished glass. "Thank you for attending." Ethan sat without hurrying. Did not sound optional. The official ignored that. A projection bloomed above the table, displaying his service record in pale blue lines. Relief assignments. Infrastructure certifications. Transfer refusals. Emergency commendations from frontier settlements no one in this room had probably ever visited. The official to the left tilted her head as though studying a curious machine. "You have shown a repeated preference for unstable environments," she said. Ethan looked at the file floating above them. "I fix things. Stable environments do not usually need me." Another official tapped the table, and the projection shifted. Civilian observations replaced technical records. Shared canteen. Uncompensated repairs. Voluntary assistance. The words looked absurd arranged in formal script, as if kindness had been translated into a language built for inventory. "These behaviors," the first official said, "have produced unusual patterns of civilian response." Ethan let his gaze move to the window and the city beyond it. "You mean people have started helping each other?" "We mean," the woman replied, "that unauthorized social influence is destabilizing predictable compliance." For one brief second Ethan almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so nakedly honest that it sounded like satire. Lyra finally turned from the glass. "The concern," she said, "is that your actions are being interpreted symbolically." Her voice was calm, but he heard something under it now, something strained by proximity to these walls and the language inside them. Ethan met her eyes. "By people who need a symbol," he said, "or by a system that is afraid of one?" No one answered immediately. The tower's climate controls whispered through hidden vents. Somewhere far below, morning traffic moved along the transit lanes like slow veins of light. The lead official folded his hands. "Mr. Walker, you are being offered a reassignment. Effective immediately, you may transfer to Central Infrastructure Annex 4. Higher pay. Better housing. Restricted contact with lower district populations. Your skills will be used where they are most efficient. Ethan understood the offer at once. Promotion as quarantine. Comfort as removal. They did not want to punish him. Punishment could make stories larger. They wanted to relocate the cause and let the feeling die on its own. He glanced at Lyra. Her face remained composed, but her eyes did not. For the first time since he had known her, they seemed almost tired. Ethan looked back at the officials and thought of the child's drawing in his jacket, the line at the public tap, the clinic boiler humming through the night because someone had bothered to stay. No, he said. It landed in the room with more force than shouting ever could have. One official frowned. You have not heard the full terms. I heard enough. Ethan leaned forward slightly, forearms on the transparent table, and kept his voice level. You are not moving me because I am useful. You are moving me because people in the lower district have started remembering they matter to one another, and that makes your system nervous. The silence afterward was absolute. Beyond the glass, the city went on breathing in the pale morning light. And somewhere inside that stillness, Ethan felt it happen, not victory, not yet, but the unmistakable sensation of a room built on control discovering that one ordinary man had just refused to be managed. The officials did not argue after that. That was what unsettled Ethan most. Men and women who believed their authority was natural usually reached for more words when obedience failed them. These three only exchanged a look across the glass table, made a notation on their tablets, and dismissed him with the cool efficiency of people filing an object into the wrong category. Ethan rose, took the elevator alone, and descended through 40 stories of polished silence while the tower lights slid over the steel doors in pale blue bands. By the time the lift opened into the public concourse, his pulse had settled, but the weight in his chest had not. He knew enough about systems to recognize the moment a machine stopped trying to persuade and started preparing alternatives. Outside, morning had sharpened into a hard, bright cold. Government skiffs moved between the upper lanes with insect precision, their undersides flashing silver in the sun, while far below the lower district wore its usual coat of weathered concrete, steam, and improvised survival. Ethan crossed the plaza toward the transit bridge, collar up against the wind, when the first alert tone sounded. It came not from the public speakers but from the maintenance channels, a 3-note pulse that hit his wrist slate half a second before it echoed from the emergency panels mounted along the bridge supports. He stopped, thumb already moving over the cracked screen. Atmospheric exchange variance, Eastern Shelter Corridor. Load imbalance rising. Secondary frost risk by nightfall. Ethan swore under his breath and pulled up the district grid. The readings climbed in uneven jumps, the kind that came when a major system had been asked to feed the wrong priority lines for too long. Someone in the upper quarter had redirected heat buffering again. The lower corridor shelters, where families crowded 3 to a room and old insulation leaked warmth through every seam, would lose thermal balance before dark if the drift continued. Behind him, a measured voice said, "I thought you would go back to your district first." Ethan turned. Lyra Voss stood at the mouth of the bridge, alone this time, no guards, no assistants, just the city light catching along the silver seam of her uniform. She looked less like an official out here and more like a thought that had stepped out of a locked room. Ethan held up the slate. "I am trying to." Her eyes flicked across the data, and whatever she saw there changed her face in a way so small most people would have missed it. "Those shelters were not scheduled for atmospheric reduction until next week," she said. "They were not scheduled for any reduction," Ethan replied. "They were sacrificed to keep upper systems comfortable." A cargo tram rolled beneath the bridge, its magnetic drive sending a tremor through the rail under Ethan's hand. Lyra looked east, toward the stacked blocks of the lower district where vapor curled from rooftop vents and laundry lines hung stubbornly between old service towers. "Can it be stabilized?" she asked. "Yes," Ethan said. "If I can get into the exchanger control room before the drift locks. After that, the whole corridor will spend the night freezing by degrees, and no report in this tower will call it what it is. He started toward the service stairs, but Lyra stepped into pace beside him. I will clear the access barriers. Ethan gave her a quick look. That would be helpful. That was not a request. No, he said, taking the stairs two at a time as cold air rushed up from the levels below. It was your first decent decision today. To his surprise, Lyra did not bristle. She matched his pace with effortless control, one hand lifting the hem of her coat clear of the metal steps while warning lights began to pulse across the underbridge conduits. The lower they descended, the more the city changed smell, from clean stone and filtered air to hot dust, coolant, wet concrete, and the familiar mineral tang of overworked infrastructure. At the landing between levels, Lyra spoke without slowing. Why did you refuse the transfer? Ethan kept moving. Because comfort is not the same thing as purpose. Most people would still choose it. That is because most people are tired, he said. And because systems like yours are built to make exhaustion feel reasonable. She was quiet for 3 steps. Then, almost lost beneath the rising alarm tone, she asked, and what makes you stay when reason says leave? Ethan pushed through the final gate into the service tunnel where steam curled along the ceiling and the pipes vibrated like living veins. He looked back at her only once before turning toward the exchanger room. Because somebody has to be there when the city starts shaking, he said, and for the first time Lyra followed him not as an observer from the empire above, but as a woman walking into the machinery of a truth she could no longer avoid. The exchanger control room was buried beneath the shelter corridor like the engine chamber of some exhausted ship, all heat shimmer, warning lights, and the constant metallic tremor of systems being pushed past the point of dignity. Ethan hit the access panel with the heel of his hand and waited half a second for the lock to cycle. Behind the door, hot air rolled out in a dense wave that smelled of dust, coolant, and scorched insulation. The main exchanger columns ran floor to ceiling in dull silver stacks, each one banded with pressure gauges that should have been holding steady in the green and were instead drifting into amber one by one. Above them, conduit lines rattled in their brackets with a tired, uneven rhythm that made Ethan think of old lungs struggling through winter. He crossed to the central console, set his slate into the diagnostic slot, and watched the data bloom across the cracked display. The room was feeding too much buffered heat to the upper terraces, exactly what he had feared. Not a failure. A decision, hidden inside technical language. Lyra stepped in behind him, and the door sealed with a hiss that shut out the outer tunnel noise. For a moment the only sounds were the pulse of the pumps and the whisper of the console fans trying to keep up. Tell me what you need, she said. Ethan looked over the readings. Manual override on the primary split valve, recalibration on the return curve, and about 3 things that should have been done a month ago. He moved to the nearest service hatch and crouched to release the panel bolts. Can you read those pressure numbers aloud? Lyra came to stand beside the rack, close enough now that he could feel the coolness she carried from the corridor being swallowed by the room's dry heat. Column 1, 72%. Column 2, 68. Column 3 rising to 74. Ethan hissed softly through his teeth. That third column is going to lock if it hits 78. Then the shelters lose balance until morning. He pulled the panel free and reached inside to the valve assembly. The metal burned through his glove almost at once. There is a stabilization bar on the left side. I need it held in place while I reset the collar. Lyra did not hesitate. She knelt beside him, precise even on a dirty floor, and braced the bar with both hands as instructed. The sight of it should have felt strange, an imperial strategist in a tailored uniform kneeling in a maintenance shaft with her sleeves dusted gray, but Ethan was too busy working to dwell on it. He fitted the torque key into the collar and leaned his weight into the turn. The assembly resisted, then shifted a fraction with a sharp metallic click. Above them the exchanger note changed, still strained, but cleaner. Again, Ethan said. Lyra held steady. Column 3, 76 and slowing. Return flow increasing by 4%. Sweat slid down Ethan's back. The room seemed hotter by the second, its light harsher, the air thinner, but the numbers were beginning to answer him. "Good," he said. "Keep talking. Column 1 holding. Column 2 rising to 70. Corridor pressure remains unstable." Her voice never shook. It moved through the noise like a line drawn with a ruler, cool and exact. Ethan reached deeper into the housing, fingers closing around the manual bypass ring, and for one awkward second his wrist slipped against the overheated casing. Before the tool could fall, Lyra caught it cleanly and placed it back into his palm without a word. That tiny motion hit him harder than he expected. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was natural. Uncalculated. The kind of reflex people had when they had started thinking in terms of help instead of hierarchy. Ethan reset the bypass, sealed the collar, and backed out as the system shuddered around them. Then, slowly, the tremor eased. Gauge lights shifted from amber to green in a wave that traveled up the columns like dawn climbing a wall. The room exhaled. So did Ethan. He sat back on his heels, breathing hard, hands blackened with grease, and looked at the restored pressure curve on the screen. Stable. Shelter corridor protected through the night. No official notice would mention what had almost happened here. No record would describe how close comfort upstairs had come to costing warmth below. But the city would feel the difference anyway in the quiet ways that mattered. Lyra rose first, brushing dust from her hands, then looked down at the grime on her fingertips as if it belonged to a language she had only just begun to read. "This," she said softly, eyes on the green-lit columns, "is what you mean, is it not?" Ethan stood, one shoulder resting against the warm metal housing. "About what?" Lyra lifted her gaze to him, and for the first time there was no empire in it, only the clear and unsettling honesty of someone discovering the shape of her own ignorance. "That keeping people alive is not the same as ruling them." Ethan studied her for a second, then nodded once. "That is a good place to start." When they stepped out of the exchanger room, the shelter corridor felt like another world. The warning lights had dimmed to a steady amber glow, and the air no longer carried that brittle edge of coming cold. Instead there was the soft, lived-in warmth of too many bodies sharing too little space and making it enough through sheer patience. Ethan wiped his hands on a rag and followed the corridor bend toward the main shelter hall, Lyra moving beside him in uncharacteristic silence. The floor vibrated faintly under their boots from the restored circulation pumps, a deep mechanical pulse that echoed through the concrete like a second heartbeat. Ahead of them, the hall opened into a long chamber lined with cots, thermal curtains, and portable heaters patched together from 3 different manufacturers and at least 2 different decades. The place smelled like warm fabric, broth, machine oil, and tired people trying not to complain. A child laughed somewhere near the far wall. Someone else answered in a language Ethan did not know, and the laugh came again, brighter this time. He slowed without thinking. So did Lyra. Along the left side of the hall, residents were passing supplies hand to hand from a storage alcove that should have required official authorization to open. No one argued over rations. No one shoved to the front. A broad-shouldered dockworker with copper skin handed out thermal wraps while an elderly woman in a faded clinic coat checked names on a paper list. Near the heaters, 2 teenagers were teaching younger children how to rotate the recharge cells so the oldest units did not overheat. At the center table, a mother from the river colonies stirred a stock pot while a man Ethan recognized from the transit yard sliced protein loaves into careful, even portions. The whole shelter moved with the quiet efficiency of a place that had learned one dangerous lesson well: if help was not coming, then help would have to become local. Lyra stopped in the middle of the aisle, her gaze moving from face to face, from hands to hands, as if she were watching a system she had never seen diagrammed before. "Who organized this?" she asked. Ethan glanced around the hall. "Probably everyone." "That is not an answer. It is the only one that matters." He nodded toward the storage alcove. "Somebody found the blankets. Somebody else made a list. Somebody had extra cells. Somebody shared food." It adds up. Lyra looked at the people again, and Ethan could almost see the old logic in her trying to name a leader, assign authority, identify the command point. But there was none. That was the point. At the far end of the hall, an imperial maintenance sentry sat on an overturned crate beside the service door, helmet off, posture rigid with embarrassment. His gray uniform was damp at the collar from the exchanger heat, and his breathing had that shallow, careful pattern Ethan knew too well from mild coolant fume exposure. Apparently the man had been stationed outside the control room during the repair and taken in too much bad air without wanting to report weakness. Ethan changed direction and walked straight toward him. The sentry noticed too late to hide it. "I am fine," he said automatically. "Sure you are," Ethan replied, kneeling to unclip the small emergency respirator from his own belt. "Take this for 10 minutes and then drink water slower than your pride wants to." The sentry blinked, startled. "You are giving me your unit?" Ethan held it out. "I am giving you a chance not to pass out in front of all these civilians. Seems merciful to both of us." A few people nearby smiled without making a show of it. The sentry hesitated, then accepted the respirator with visible reluctance and equal relief. Lyra watched the exchange with an expression so still it almost looked absent, but Ethan had learned better by now. Her stillness meant she was rearranging something deep inside herself. When he stood, a little turquoise-skinned girl from the square appeared at the end of the row holding 2 tin cups of broth, one in each hand, steam curling into the corridor light. She looked first at Ethan, then at Lyra, and offered 1 cup to each of them with solemn ceremony. No speech. No fear. Just a simple decision to include. Ethan took his cup with a quiet thanks. Lyra accepted hers more slowly, as if she were being handed something heavier than soup. Around them, the shelter kept moving in its gentle, practical rhythm, people warming one another not by order, not by law, but by choice. And as Lyra stood there with steam rising past her face and the noise of shared survival all around her, Ethan saw the truth settle into her eyes at last. Power could force a city into silence, but only kindness could teach it how to breathe together. The broth had barely cooled in Ethan's hands when the shelter hall changed. It was not dramatic at first. No alarms, no shouted commands, nothing loud enough to deserve the word crisis. Just a subtle shift in the air, the way conversation thinned at the edges when people sensed authority approaching. Heads turned toward the main entrance one by one. The dock worker near the blanket straightened. The clinic woman lowered her paper list. Even the children seemed to feel it, their voices fading into the heater hum and the soft clatter of tin cups. Ethan looked up and saw a line of imperial officials entering the shelter with the careful, polished calm of people who preferred to control rooms by making them hold their breath. At their center walked a man Ethan had never seen before and somehow recognized at once. High Marshal Kaler did not need insignia to announce rank, though he wore plenty of it. Authority sat on him the way frost sat on steel, hard, quiet, and meant to last. His uniform was deep black with narrow bands of silver at the shoulders, severe enough to make everyone around him look temporary. His face was not cruel. It was worse than cruel. It was composed. The expression of someone who had spent a lifetime mistaking order for virtue. Lyra set her untouched cup down on the nearest table. Ethan saw the motion from the corner of his eye and knew instantly that her silence beside him was no longer wonder. It was dread. Kaler stopped in the center aisle and let his gaze move through the shelter, taking in the cots, the heaters, the shared supplies, the residents who had begun helping each other without waiting to be told how. His eyes paused on the open storage alcove, the orderly ration table, the imperial sentry still holding Ethan's respirator. Then, at last, he looked at Ethan. "Mr. Walker," he said, and his voice was low, smooth, and impossible to interrupt without feeling childish. "You seem to leave unusual patterns wherever you go." Ethan set his own cup down. The hall had gone so still he could hear the tiny click of a heater regulator somewhere near the back wall. "That depends on what you call unusual." Kaler regarded him for a moment as though measuring the usefulness of honesty. Mutual aid without central authorization. Civilians bypassing official channels. Residents choosing one another over procedural dependency. I would call that unusual in an occupied district. Ethan did not look away. I would call it survival. A faint murmur ran through the hall and disappeared just as quickly. Kaler let it die on its own. Beside him, Lyra remained motionless, but Ethan could feel the tension in her like a second current in the room. The High Marshal folded his hands behind his back and took one slow step forward. You misunderstand the nature of stability, Mr. Walker. Stability is not the absence of suffering. It is the management of it. Predictably. Efficiently. Quietly. The words landed over the shelter like a sheet of cold metal. Ethan thought of the child's drawing in his jacket, the shared water, the green lights climbing the exchanger columns, the sentry with his borrowed respirator, and felt something in him settle rather than rise. No, he said. That is not stability. That is maintenance for obedience. A few residents inhaled at once. Kaler's expression did not change, but the room changed around him, tightening, as if even the walls had heard a line being crossed. You are not on trial, Kaler said. Not yet. But your presence is becoming structurally inconvenient. There are worlds in this empire that were pacified by force in half the time this district has resisted simple compliance. Do you know why? Ethan glanced at the families gathered behind the curtain rows, the children pressed against their parents, the workers standing shoulder to shoulder with clinic staff and retirees and laborers and one embarrassed sentry who had not given back the respirator. Because you do not understand what people are for, he said. For the first time, Kaler's eyes sharpened. Not with anger. With interest. The kind a scientist might show a reaction too strange to dismiss. And what are they for? He asked. Ethan looked around the shelter hall, at the blankets passing hand to hand, at the pot still warm on the center table, at Lyra standing in silence with dust still faintly marking the hem of her uniform from the exchanger room below. One another, he said. No one moved after that. No one needed to. The answer itself seemed to alter the temperature of the space. Ethan saw it strike Kaler not as sentiment, but as threat. Because in that single quiet word lay the one thing force had never managed to manufacture, belonging. And as the High Marshal stood in the middle of a shelter held together by choice instead of fear, Ethan understood at last why the Empire had come in person. It was not here to punish a man. It was here to study a contagion. They did not remove Ethan from the shelter by force. That would have been too honest. Instead, High Marshal Kaler made a small gesture, and two officials stepped forward with the polished restraint of men carrying out something administrative rather than consequential. The residents parted because they had learned what happened to spaces that refused to part, but no one lowered their eyes this time. Ethan felt that difference as clearly as heat on skin. He unzipped his jacket long enough to hand the borrowed respirator back to the embarrassed sentry, then turned to the dockworker and the clinic woman. Near the ration table. Keep the exchanger load under 70 until morning, he said. Rotate the heater cells every 40 minutes. Do not let the corner units run dry. The clinic woman nodded once, jaw set. The dockworker repeated the instructions under his breath like a vow. Only then did Ethan move. Lyra fell into step on his left. Kaler walked ahead without looking back, certain the corridor would follow him because it always had. The shelter doors sealed behind them with a soft hydraulic sigh, and the warmth of shared bodies gave way to the colder air of the transit passage. Overhead strips cast long white bars across the floor, making everyone look briefly segmented, like figures caught between one life and the next. Where are we going? Ethan asked. Kaler answered without breaking stride. To the square. Ethan glanced at the marshal's calm profile. You came all this way for a speech? I came, Kaler said, to correct a narrative. The words were delivered with the same tone a surgeon might use to describe resetting a joint. Ahead, the corridor opened onto a private lift that climbed through the city's spine in near silence. Through the glass wall Ethan watched the levels slide past, shelter blocks, clinic terraces, market bridges, the government quarter above them all like a polished lid placed over a living thing. Dawn was beginning to gather in the east, turning the horizon pale silver. By the time the lift opened into the upper concourse, maintenance crews were already clearing frost from the plaza stones below. A public address platform had been raised overnight in the center of the square, sleek and temporary, the kind of structure meant to disappear as soon as it had done its work. Ethan understood then. Kaler was not planning punishment. He was planning theater. In a holding chamber just off the plaza, warm with filtered air and lit too brightly to be kind, Kaler finally turned to face him fully. Lyra remained near the door, very still. A tray had been set out on the side table with water, fruit, and a pressed gray coat folded to regulation lines. Ethan ignored all of it. "You have an unusual opportunity this morning," Kaler said. "You may speak to the district. You may tell them what every stable civilization eventually learns, that kindness without structure becomes dependency, and dependency without discipline becomes unrest. You may advise them to return to official channels, and this matter ends here." Ethan looked at the coat, the water, the perfect arrangement of comfort offered only after obedience had been priced. "You want me to tell them to stop helping each other?" "I want you," Kaler replied, "to name unregulated sentiment for what it is, volatility." For a second, the room was so quiet Ethan could hear the faint resonance of the plaza speakers being tested outside. He thought of the child's drawing in his pocket, the pressure gauges turning green, the sentry holding a respirator he had not expected to receive, Lyra's dust-marked hands in the exchanger room, the shelter hall breathing like a single organism made of separate hearts. Then he looked at Kaler and saw the truth with sudden clarity. The marshal was not afraid of unrest. He was afraid of affection that did not require permission. Ethan lifted the glass of water from the table, considered it, then set it back untouched. "No," he said. Kaler's expression did not change. "Consider carefully." "I already did." Ethan turned slightly so that Lyra, standing by the door, could hear him as clearly as the man in front of him. "Power can organize a crowd. It can ration heat. It can schedule silence. But it cannot teach people to belong to one another. That part has to be chosen." Kaler studied him for a long moment, and in the stillness Ethan saw something colder than anger settle into the marshal's face. Not fury. Decision. Outside, the square speakers clicked live one by one, their test tones carrying through the chamber wall like metal raindrops. Kaler stepped aside and gestured toward the plaza. "Then let the district hear exactly what you choose," he said. And when Ethan walked toward the light, he did so knowing he had just refused the last comfortable door the Empire was ever going to offer him. The plaza had filled before sunrise, though no one had called it a gathering. People simply arrived the way frost arrived on stone, quietly, layer by layer, until the square could no longer pretend it was empty. Ethan stepped onto the public platform and felt the cold through the soles of his boots at once. The air carried that metallic winter taste unique to occupied cities, half ozone from the traffic lanes above and half old water from the dry fountain at the center of the square. Around the platform, imperial speakers hung from temporary pylons like silver fruit, waiting to turn one man's voice into policy. Kaler stood several feet behind him with the still patience of someone certain that truth, once amplified, could be managed like everything else. Lyra remained at the edge of the dais near the transmission console, her posture exact, her face unreadable, but Ethan noticed her right hand resting not at her side but near the manual broadcast keys. The square below was a sea of coats, work jackets, clinic uniforms, market aprons, transport leathers, and children wrapped in patched thermal cloth. He saw the turquoise-skinned girl from the square near the front beside the elderly vendor and the dockworker from the shelter. He saw the embarrassed sentry in gray standing off to one side without his helmet, looking less like an enforcer than a man who had slept badly. Above them all, the first sunlight touched the government towers and turned their glass facades white as ice. A technician signaled. The speakers clicked live. Ethan could hear his own breathing for one strange, suspended second, and then he heard the city breathing too. Not one sound. Thousands. A cough. A heater cart rattling over stone. Fabric shifting in the wind. Someone holding a child a little higher to see. Kaler inclined his head once, a gesture so small it barely existed. Begin. Ethan looked out over the district and understood with sudden clarity that this was what power always wanted in the end, not merely obedience, but participation in your own silencing. He stepped toward the microphone and spoke the only way he knew how, without performance, without polish, like a man standing in a boiler room telling the truth because the gauge would not lie for him. He said he had worked on worlds broken by storms, shortages, neglect, and conquest, and the pattern was always the same. Systems failed first where people had been taught they were expendable. He said no empire was stable if its warmth depended on who mattered least. He said a city did not become strong when everyone learned to fear the same command. It became strong when people decided not to let one another disappear. His voice carried across the square and up the tower glass and into the market lanes. Beyond, plain and unadorned, more dangerous for that very reason. Behind him, Kaler did not move. Ethan went on. He said he had been told kindness was volatile, inefficient, unsanctioned. But the shelters had stayed warm because neighbors passed blankets hand to hand. Children had eaten because workers shared rations before they were ordered to. A sentry had kept standing because someone gave him air instead of humiliation. He said power could ration survival, but only compassion could turn survival into community. When he finished, the square held stillness like a held breath. Kaler took one measured step forward, ready perhaps to reclaim the moment with the language of order. Then Lyra moved first. She pressed her hand to the manual console and the transmission lights changed from district blue to imperial white. Ethan heard the technician gasp behind the speakers as secondary channels opened one after another, not just to the square, but to the shelter corridor, the clinic terraces, the upper transit decks, the outlying work blocks, every public receiver tied to the district grid. Lyra lifted her chin and spoke into the live feed before Kaler could stop her. Her voice was cool, clear, and impossible to mistake. She said the record would show that no sabotage had stabilized the exchangers, no coercion had kept the shelters orderly, no threat had caused civilians from 5 species to share heat, food, and labor with greater precision than any administrative directive had achieved. She said the district had not become harder to govern. It had become harder to justify governing this way. Below the platform, no one cheered. The response was stranger, quieter, and far more devastating. An old woman near the front removed the extra scarf from around her neck and wrapped it around the shoulders of a child beside her. A transit worker placed his ration tin on the dry fountain rim and stepped back so others could add to it. The dock worker from the shelter set down 2 fresh heater cells for anyone who needed them. Then another person did the same with water. Then another with medicine strips. Then another with gloves. Across the square, hands began offering what they had before anyone asked. No slogans. No raised fists. Just 100 small refusals to live by scarcity of the heart. Ethan watched the movement spread outward through the crowd like warmth through frozen pipes. Invisible at first, then undeniable. And for the first time since he had seen the Marshal, he watched High Marshal Kaler lose something he had never imagined could be taken from him, the certainty that fear was the deepest law in the room. The square did not erupt. That was what Ethan remembered later, more than the cold, more than the towers, more than the way the morning light kept sliding down the government glass as if nothing in the universe had changed. There was no riot, no anthem, no dramatic fracture in the sky. Just people. People stepping closer to one another instead of away. People setting down what they could spare and discovering, almost with surprise, that it was enough to begin. Water containers appeared first, then wrapped loaves, heater cells, clinic packs, gloves, spare filters, small folded blankets, all of it gathering around the dry fountain in a widening circle of ordinary defiance so gentle it became impossible to condemn without revealing exactly what kind of rule had always been standing over them. Ethan remained on the platform for a long moment after the speakers fell silent, the wind pressing cool against his face, the metallic smell of winter and old stone rising from the plaza below. Beside the console, Lyra stood with her hand still resting on the broadcast panel, as if she could feel the echo of her choice in the metal. High Marshal Kaler said nothing. That silence, coming from a man like him, sounded less like restraint than loss. Around the square, imperial personnel did not advance. They looked to him for instruction and found, for the first time, that certainty was not waiting there. Ethan stepped down from the platform without ceremony. No guard stopped him. No one announced what came next because no one in power had written language for a moment like this. The turquoise-skinned girl met him near the fountain with the grave seriousness children carried when they had already seen too much. In her hands was the same dented metal cup from the first morning. She held it out without a word. Ethan took it, walked to the nearest supply container, filled it from a public water canister someone had set down among the offerings, and placed it carefully on the stone rim where everyone could reach it. A simple thing. A practical thing. Yet the motion seemed to settle over the square like a final answer. Hours later, when the official notices began changing tone, they did not call it surrender. They called it temporary district recalibration, a review of resource distribution, a procedural reassessment of civilian engagement protocols. Empires were fluent in euphemism when reality embarrassed them. But the shelters stayed warm that night. The public taps remained open. The exchanger loads were balanced according to need rather than status. Clinic supply doors unlocked in 3 lower blocks without explanation. By evening, the first occupation banner came down from the eastern transit arch, not torn, not burned, simply unhooked by a maintenance crew that did not put it back. Ethan spent the day where he always had, with tools in his hands and grease under his nails. He repaired a cracked relay at the old clinic, reset a heater bank in the shelter corridor, and by dusk found himself kneeling beside the public fountain, replacing the mineral-choked valve assembly beneath its basin while the square around him breathed with a softer rhythm than he had ever heard there. The stone was cold through his work pants. The brass fittings bit his fingertips. Water pressure fought him once, then yielded with a clean internal click. A second later, clear water rose through the center pipe and spilled out in a bright, steady stream that caught the last light of day like poured glass. He sat back on his heels and listened to the sound of it. Not loud. Not grand. Just water returning to a place that had needed it. When he looked up, Lyra was standing a few feet away in the deepening blue of evening, no guards, no rank markers, only a dark coat over plain clothes and the strange calm of a person who had stepped out of one life without yet knowing the shape of the next. She watched the fountain for a moment before speaking. "We spent generations believing power was what made worlds endure," she said softly. Ethan wiped his hands on a rag and glanced at the line already forming with cups and containers, residents from different species waiting with the patient ease of people no longer afraid to be seen beside one another. "And now?" he asked. Lyra looked at the faces in the square, at the children leaning over the basin to watch the water, at the clinic. Woman talking with the dockworker, at the embarrassed sentry helping an old vendor lift a supply crate onto a cart. When she answered, her voice had lost all trace of imperial distance. "Now I think worlds endure because someone keeps choosing not to let another person vanish." Ethan folded the rag and tucked it into his tool case. Around them the city lights came on one by one, but they no longer felt like a lid pressed over the dark. They felt like windows. He touched the sketch in his inner pocket, the crooked little cup with light drawn inside it, and listened to the fountain run. He had not come here to conquer anything. He had not even come here to be remembered. He was only a tired human with a wrench, a stubborn sense of right and wrong, and the inconvenient habit of treating lives like they mattered. In the end, that was enough. The stars above the city remained distant and cold, but down in the square, under the rising lights and the sound of fresh water, a broken world remembered what hearts were for.